Hi, everyone. My name is Tumelo Mojapelo. Today, we are having a 15-minute conversation with Rika. Rika, please just introduce yourself and just tell us a bit about what systems thinking is for all our viewers who don't know what it is.
Thank you very much to me for the invitation to join you. My name is Rika Preiser. I'm based at the Stellenbosch center called the Center for Sustainability Transitions. It's an interdisciplinary research center where I'm an associate professor and where I've been working on using systems thinking since, I would say, 2009, in respect of how to solve problems better and how to understand change. So I have a background in philosophy and anthropology, and I think my ideas were what kind of inspired me is how these ideas were represented in the field of science. And of course, then with the birth of our center, we drew people who were, I would say, working at the coalface, people who were activists, change makers, decision makers, NGO owners and activists, I would say industry, parastatals, that all thought that engaging with sustainability and decision-making in this time of uncertainty needs a new perspective. And so all our ideas that we had and the ideas of systems thinking that were born, I would say, after the Second World War and kind of became a body of knowledge around about the 1950s, are challenged really to engage with these current, I would say, challenges that we have in the world, mainly that has to do with how things change, the kind of, I would say, the fact that nothing is really predictable, the uncertainty, but also understanding that the models and the methods and the decision-making models that we've had about how to engage with business, they don't hold anymore for the times in which we are living. So really systems thinking in my work around that is to explore how a better understanding of systems thinking or understanding how that works could help us inform decision-making in a better way and in making interventions in a way that acknowledges how things are interrelated with one another.
So for someone who doesn't know, especially like a leader who's just trying to figure things out, what is system thinking? Especially now that you've mentioned that you are trying to focus on your approaches within systems thinking that deal with uncertainty, as well as making decisions in a world filled with complexity and uncertainty.
Well, systems thinking emerged after the Second World War, like I mentioned, when researchers really were, I would say, forced to work together to solve problems. In this space, physicists had to work with economists and sociologists and government policymakers to kind of, see how to restructure the world after that time, and drawing on knowledge that came out of neural network, understanding the brain and how the brain operates and how we can model that. Understanding about a deeper understanding of the biosphere and ecosystems, and then combined with, I would say, advancements in computer technology, cybernetics, as they call it, this idea of systems thinking emerged. And really the core idea is that we rethink that reality doesn't exist out of little small building blocks that kind of stand for and by themselves, but actually that we see reality emerging as how these different components are actually linked together, and that these components interact on each other in specific ways. And the way in which they interact on each other is not like what they call very linear. So the amount of input, so if you would push a little block, the amount of effort you would exert on pushing the block would, according to kind of Newtonian laws, you could kind of then make a little equation about that and say the amount of effort you put into moving the block would make it predictable how far the block would move. So that we call, very predictable Newtonian mechanisms, and the science that influences that is that, once we have all those criteria, we can make predictions and we can put them into the system, and we can predict, how big or how far the move would be depending on the weight and the speed of the block at which it moves. But living systems work with a different kind of a logic. We say that they have nonlinear interactions. So if you think about, for example, using nitrogen in the earth or putting compost in the earth, the amount of nitrogen that you put into soil, might bring have some kind of consequence that you could measure plant growth. Maybe not totally directly to the amount of compost you put in the soil, but at some stage, if you put more compost on, the plant will even die. So it means that our input and output models work in a different way, and that there are cumulative effects. And those cumulative effects, they produce what we call emergent phenomena, unexpected outcomes, and they have what we then call cascading mechanisms. So those effects, they don't just work on the things that we are operating at right now, but they have cascading effects into the whole system. So, and we saw that very nicely, well, in a very bad way, I would say, but in a very spectacular way with the COVID pandemic, where something really small that happened in a local market in Wuhan had cascading effects right until, where we sat in our living rooms and had to be locked in, thousands of kilometers away. And once we understand that actually each interaction in the world operates like that, that challenges how we think about the future, how we make decisions, how we think about our organizations. And often we define organizations as something that's quite a closed unit, and that we want to well define, and that we can have our operations inside that. But what the systems thinking tells us, that we are actually context specific, we are contextually located, and everything we do in a specific context will have, these cascading effects into other contexts.
That's very interesting. So what makes it different to other decision-making models or frameworks?
I think from what we've inherited from, I would say, traditional scientific methods that stemmed from, I would say, science that was born in the in the 16 somethings, in the 1618s. Our understanding of the world at that time really assumed that we were kind of what we call systems in equilibrium, meaning that that we could that things were well defined, and we could understand them if we knew what the parts were, what the interactions were. But the science really that informs systems thinking is what we call the science of non-equilibrium. And that's a kind of a understanding of reality and how things work in organizations, that says that something always has to be out of balance for it to be alive. And that these the changes that happen in how we engage with information or energy, or how we interact, that can never be in equilibrium, or in a kind of a stasis. And when things are out of equilibrium, it means that our economic models have to change. Our economic models today, the idea of capitalism, the idea of neoliberal economic modeling, assumes a kind of an equilibrium, I would say, status of the world. But really, if we understand that the world is a complex system, and systems thinking can help us understand that, we need a new economic model for understanding, there isn't something like a rational agent that makes decisions based on some kind of understanding of equilibrium status of the world. And also individuals aren't the same. We make decisions really based on all other kinds of things. So how do organizations make decisions, or how do we think about risk? How do we think about strategy? All these models that we currently have were informed by a certain understanding of the world that is in stasis, well-defined and predictable. The idea of a management organogram, for example, assumes that there's a leader, and then there's departments, and then there's workers. It assumes that something that that leadership or decision making can be concentrated in one specific spot. But systems thinking tells us that actually living systems have what we call a way of organizing themselves in a way that the leadership or agency can be located in any place of the system. And if we can start activating those capacities, we'll have a different understanding of an organogram or leadership even.
I like this talk about leadership, and how sometimes the assumption is that there's a structured approach to who has power, or who has the potential to mobilize or give people a sense of agency. And also the idea that sometimes leadership is not, especially in an organizational setting, is not always allocated where you would assume would be allocated, which brings me to my next question. If you are a leader and you want to maybe use the principles or the principles of systems thinking to be able to make decisions and maybe also give agency, right, to your team, how would you go about that? Like, how would you integrate those principles into your organization, or not even your organization? Let's start like with yourself, into the decisions that you make, right? Because it seems like you'd have to have a mindset shift from where you move from thinking that things are linear and predictable to where you understand that in a complex environment, uncertainty can come from anywhere.
Absolutely. I think that's maybe the beginning, to expect uncertainty and to not be surprised by it, and know that we should be calculating expected, that into our kind of understanding of the world, and that things are more fluid than that they are stable. But I would say also to kind of embrace the fact that context matters, and that context isn't just the backdrop into where our organization is based, but context actually plays a very positive role into how the organization is shaped and emerges. So once we also shift and understand that context is something that's alive, that's a constant, there's a constant feeding back and fro, and also a kind of a, I would say, a mutually constituting element of context to what the organization is, we have to think differently then about, how do we think about import, export? How do we think about structuring an organization? What kind of incentives do we offer? And what is the role and the function of that organization within the context once again? So these things are mutually constituting. So that changes our idea of how we are situated. And I think also to kind of allow for positive learning to happen all the time, reflection. If complex systems are constituted through relations, it also means that we have to actually invest a lot more in relationship building.
Okay.
Understanding that relationship building is about building trust, and that these relations is actually what keeps our business alive. It's not an add-on, it's not a extra something that we kind of put into the budget when we have time and capacity, but fostering good relations within the organization and within the context of the organization is quite key. And also I would say then to actually start thinking about what are those small things that we could do. And this is what the idea of leverage points. What are the small things that we could do that might have a large effect? Often we think we need a lot of money and huge budget to bring about change. But if we understand this idea that small things can have large effects, we can actually optimize in a much different way than what we think. Often we say we don't have resources, but actually we have to start reading the system and see where are those leverage points that can be a small change could have a large effect. And I think that doesn't have to cost the world in a sense, and we can optimize on that. And then also the idea of optimization is challenged, because if we look at our supply chain systems these days, they are so optimized that they make the system quite rigid. And when something is rigid, it's very brittle and breaks easily. So to build in some slowness or some reserve or some kind of redundancy, so that we don't optimize to such effect that we actually kill the system instead of keeping it alive. So I think that those are just small things that we can start implementing.
I like this idea of doing small things. Have you ever had an instance, and maybe you can share an example where you've seen people do small things, but they were disastrous? And how do we avoid that using systems thinking? Is there like,
Well,
sometimes
also,
I'm so sorry.
yeah,
Sometimes
no,
you do
also to say,
something,
well, if they, yeah.
sometimes you do something, and what basically happens is you're doing this small thing and you think it's got a positive effect, but it's reinforcing a cycle that when you like add its compounding effect is actually negative. So, how do you firstly decipher, and how do you avoid those cycles where you just literally go into the spiral where you're doing these little things and you think they're good, but they're actually negative?
So like, meaning, I would say like microaggressions in the workplace, where these kind of microaggressions, you kind of just ignore someone all the time, or you speak up in the wrong way, or you show up in the wrong way. But the people who have to work with you, that adds up and people feel excluded and experience racism or sexism in a very large way. That's, I would say, a really good example of how small things can have large effects in a negative sense. So I think that's quite that's coming quite to the fore these days, that how do we, so that's the other side of it, that that just because something is small, it doesn't mean those effects can't compound and bring about huge experiences of exclusion, inequality, feeling unsafe in the workplace, and also the effects of privilege, for example, I would say, are such kind of micro aggressions. So understanding those things, I would say, is really a space for people then to start putting effort into that as well. To say, well, what are the things that we can do to start seeing those things, become aware of them, understanding that these have cumulative effects. And on the other side, it's also, those are the spaces where where it's the most exciting, I think, to start conversations and to say, well, if this is, we can actually change that through having different kinds of conversations. We don't have to build a new building or, build a new institution to change those things. We actually have the power and can empower ourselves to connect with each other in different ways. It wouldn't cost a lot. It will just take some kind of willingness and awareness, and people that actually have the courage to be vulnerable with each other. In a way that can hold that space for each other. So those are also what we call, so we work with this notion of what we call transformative spaces, where we become very mindful about what are the small signals that we can bring to a space that might bring make people feel more welcome, more at home. And it doesn't cost much. It just really it takes more like a courage and will to be able to expose our humanity a bit more, rather than hiding behind our structures that we have.
I like this, what you're talking about. And I just want to ask you one final question, because I think you've answered so many of my questions. How does then a leader, using systems thinking, right, decide on wise actions for the future? Because I love the way you talked about creating transformative spaces. So in the case of transformative spaces, so working with the example that you've given, how does a leader start? So if I needed like the 5 steps of integrating systems thinking into my approach, or let's say the 5 steps of creating a transformative space, where do I begin and how do I do it?
That's the holy grail you're speaking about. And I think there isn't a recipe or a quick fix for any of these, or a best practice book even. I think it starts really with awareness, understanding that we impact on each other in ways that we might have intentions about, but also those intentions would have unintentional consequences. And having an awareness or an understanding that we will always be in trouble. And for that reason, we actually have to exert more effort in, like I say, building relationships, creating spaces where people can show up differently, allowing spaces for people to show up through diversity and respect. Those things seem so minimal and so small, but it opens up, I would say, often when we come to work, we just assume that we are roles, that we are, that we show up in roles that are functional and purposeful, but actually we show up as whole people. So allowing people to show up in a whole way where they can bring their embodied selves to a space already, I would say, opens up a beginning for relational, I would say, competency, relational awareness, to warm up, a room or a working environment. And from there on, I would say reflexiveness, honesty, courage, willingness to be open-minded, to change often, willingness to reflect critically on privilege, critically on who's included, excluded, is important, but then also thinking that not everything that can be measurable, speaking of KPIs, actually count. So creating other kinds of mechanisms and incentives that recognizes the labor of love and the hard work that people bring to a space to make a space what it is, I would say is really one of those more intangible things, but they are so important. Being able and willing to learn, adapt, be inclusive, and get everyone's voice in the place, I think allows us to show up as humans. And for me, we've actually lost how to show up or create spaces for that, because when we only are interested in KPIs or measuring outputs or to optimize, the warmth of your humanity has to kind of go out of the window. So how do we bring that recognition back into a space, I would say, is one of the key things for me.
Thank you so much, Rika, for your time. I'm just gonna maybe just wrap up what you said. Basically, in a nutshell, systems thinking is an approach that basically humanizes the way we look at uncertainty and make decisions. And it's actually a method, or let's say a framework, that is very necessary in today's world, because like you say, we're not one-dimensional, rigid individuals, but when we come into a space, regardless of whether we're facing uncertainty or complexity, we come with our whole selves, not just one dimension of ourselves. And the way we show up actually has an impact on the results or the outcomes of what happens within a setting or an organization. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. For those who are watching, please continue to stay tuned to our 15-minute conversations. There are a few previous conversations that you can look back on that build on this concept. Like, subscribe, and join us for future conversations. Thank you. Thank you, Rika.
Thank you very much.